All right, and I think we're live. Welcome back, everyone, from your lunch break. Welcome back to National Spectrum Management Association Online 2021. We're pleased, very pleased to have Janka and Trey Hanbury here for the Satellite Mega Constellation High in Demand panel. There's a lot going on here, and just real quick before we jump into it, for those of you who haven't met John or Trey before, John is a Chief Officer, Global Government Affairs at ViaSat, and Trey is a partner at Hogan Lovells and does a lot of satellite application and deployment work. And again, we're extremely pleased to have them here and get a little mind share today. And we're going to have John do a little presentation. Trey will do a little presentation. I'll bat a little cleanup, and then we'll open it up for folks to, if they have any questions or comments. On your buttons on the right, the chat buttons, or if you want to talk live, you can raise your hand on the toolbar on the right. We'll take it away, John. Good to see you, John.
All right. Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. Thought I'd try to have a discussion today about what's going on in this so-called new space age, how things have evolved in the past few years. Where things look like they're going, and how do the existing legal and regulatory paradigms work in this new environment? All of us have been in the field for a long time, and whether you've been in the field for 30 some years or 20 some years or 10 years, I think it's all fair to say we've had a similar experience. Technology often outpaces the law. No matter how hard anyone tries, it's often hard to guess what's going to occur and write the rules. And what's really important is that we take these changes into account, see how they're working, and decide whether we need to adjust the prior approaches that we've had. So I was just hoping to walk you through, at least where I see areas where there's tensions between the way we've been doing it and the way it probably has to go. And then we'll, obviously have a discussion as we go forward here. So I hate to start it this way, but what's wrong right now? Well, look, we have a lot of very exciting things that have been proposed. There are a lot of really innovative systems that have been proposed in LEO orbit. And I think it's fair to say that these systems are massive in scale. We've had something on the order of about 9,000 satellites launched since Sputnik in the late 1950s. And depending on who you believe, we're talking about potentially 50,000 LEO satellites being launched with the U.S. flag in the coming years. And we're talking about operating satellites here. That doesn't take into account the replacements. The lifetimes of these satellites varies by operator, but as a general rule for this discussion, let's say that they have a 5-year life. So if there's a constellation of, as one's been proposed, 30,000 satellites, and they have a 5-year life, we're talking about nearly 100,000 satellites being launched over a 15-year license term. Why 15 years? That's the license term that the FCC uses. We're in the United States, so that's why we're talking about that right now. So what are the issues? One is a physical issue. I know this isn't specifically a spectrum issue, but it does relate to spectrum because if you can't access space physically, you can't use the spectrum that's needed to provide the services. So the first issue we'll talk about a little is collisions in space, the increased risk due to failed satellites and an unsafe orbital congestion that's starting to develop, right? And conceptually, it's no different for those of you who are in Washington to, what happens when the Beltway fills up and cars start breaking down on the road. It's just a lot more dangerous situation. Next category is really about the spectrum issues. And it's what I consider really untenable approaches to shared use of the limited orbital resources we have, which are both radio spectrum and the physical orbits in which satellites need to operate. And then I'd like to have a little bit of a thought about, what's the impact of U.S. policies, and how does that affect competition and innovation in the United States? There's a lot of discussion about the United States being a leader in space. We have been. We all want that to be the case. But I think sometimes we don't consider the consequences of our actions and how that may actually quell innovation and competition. So here's something to think about, and it's a lot of information, but it's just maybe a prediction about where the world's going to go. If you look at the number of geostationary satellites that are in orbit, and I think everybody knows, but these are the satellites that are 22,300 miles above the equator. They appear fixed relative to the Earth. There are U.S. flags on approximately 27% of those satellites. So therefore, about 73% of the geostationary satellites around the world are non-U.S. flagged. So what do we expect to happen in the non-geo world? Do we expect the U.S. to have a monopoly on non-geos? Not at all. There's no reason to expect that. There's nothing unique about a U.S. licensed non-geo system. In fact, I would propose that we can expect roughly the same proportion of non-U.S. licensed non-geo satellites as U.S. licensed. I'm sorry, let me try that again. I think you can expect about the same percentage of non-U.S. licensed non-geos as non-U.S. licensed geos. So just to do the math, there's about 50,000 LEOs currently before the FCC, give or take. If you apply the same percentages, we're looking at 125,000 to 250,000 non-U.S. systems. And if you back that down and say, oh, come on, John, everybody files this stuff at the FCC and nobody ever deploys. Well, let's just assume that only 20% of those deploy. It's only 10,000 U.S. licensed satellites. Well, we're still talking about 25,000 to 50,000 foreign systems around the world. Okay, so you say that's really interesting, but how does any of this relate to me? Like, why do I care? Well, there's a couple reasons. One goes to just space safety. Satellite systems, if they're going to operate and operate reliably, need to be in an environment that is relatively safe. You need to have a situation where you don't expect the collisions, the kinds of collisions that can be debilitating. They can disable a spacecraft. In some cases, they can destroy a spacecraft. And in other cases, you can completely fragment the spacecraft. So historically, we in the US have applied a test, which is a single satellite collision risk metric. We look at a single satellite and we say, what are the chances of this thing having a collision with a piece of orbital debris, a piece of space junk, during its orbital lifetime? and that threshold has been 1 in 1,000. Okay, we've gotten comfortable with that. It's not risk-free. Now we move into the situation where we have constellations of many thousands of satellites. And there's been advocacy to apply that same limit to the multi-thousand constellations. And you look at the math and you have to scratch your head and wonder, does that make any sense? Well, previously, if somebody was putting up a single satellite, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance of a collision. Now, if they're putting up 4,400 satellites, to take an example, we can do the math and see that we expect 4.4 collisions every 5 years. I think that's too many as something that we should expect. And if why does this matter? It matters for the reason depicted in the second graph here, which is the result on space debris from a collision between merely 2 spacecraft about 10 years ago. There was a US commercial spacecraft that collided with a Russian defunct satellite, and it caused a step increase in the amount of orbital debris. And you say, well, okay, doesn't that just affect those 2 operators? Is anybody else affected? And the answer is yes, they are. It's the third chart. When 2 satellites collide, there's a huge amount of kinetic energy that's released, and the satellites will fragment, and the debris will spread into many orbits hundreds of kilometers above and below. And this debris is smaller, obviously, than the original spacecraft, and it takes a lot longer to ever fall out of space. So this debris cloud that gets created can last for decades or even centuries. I mean, it's not unlike 2 cars colliding on the freeway and sending debris into all the other lanes that imperil all the other drivers. So first proposition is the metrics we were using in the past don't make sense in the current world, and they have to get revisited. Another thing that hasn't been fully vetted yet is when we're evaluating collision risk, what goes into the calculation? And some of this may be basic, but I think it's often lost. The first thing is a very simple proposition, but it's undeniable, and that is that a satellite that is not maneuverable can't avoid collisions. And that means that satellites have to be built with propulsion or other mechanisms to ensure that they can get out of the way of debris that's hurtling at them at 17,000 miles an hour. And that maneuverability has to be present in the satellite for its entire orbital lifetime. Because it doesn't do you any good to have it work part of the time and then have the satellite fail and turn into a rock. It becomes another source of collision risk. There's another category of things that are important in this conjunctions not avoided category. And what's that about? Well, there's always some risk of orbital debris colliding with a satellite. And there's a bit of uncertainty when you're calculating whether a collision's going to occur. Science is good. The radars are pretty good. But people typically will maneuver when the risk of a collision exceeds a certain threshold. It might be a risk of 1 in 10,000, or it might be a risk of 1 in 100,000. Okay, individually, that's not a bad compromise. We need service. There's some risk. We're managing it reasonably. But what happens when we start having many thousands of satellites? You find in certain orbits, we're having tens of millions of these conjunctions or close calls over the course of 15 years. And that means that, again, just as we discussed in the case of collision risk in the first instance, small probability events start to add up when there's large numbers of them. And that has to get factored in. So the tools that are developed to manage collision risk need to take into account these two factors. And most important, it's critical that operators have a plan to manage any excess risk that exists, as opposed to simply ignoring it and hoping that it never comes to fruition. It's really important that systems be designed so that operators are monitoring their satellites and understanding what their health of their satellites is and removing them from orbit before they fail. Because they can, if they're maneuverable, they can avoid collisions at a reasonable level while they're in orbit. Once they fail and turn into rocks, they start to create unreasonable levels of risk. So we think it's critical that these types of remediation plans be put into effect and managed to ensure that everyone else can use the orbit safely. You know, as the spectrum, we have a very new issue that's arising, and that is the preclusive effects of large constellations on smaller constellations. Just because a constellation is large doesn't make it good. I think, as we all know, there's many things in life that, you know, may be big, but aren't the most efficient. But we have rules in place that were developed in the US that basically favor the deployment of massive constellations and work to the detriment of smaller constellations. And this chart shows you comparing System B and its effect on a System A. And you can see that if System B has 3,000 satellites, it nearly blocks the sky when it comes to a constellation of 300 satellites. It basically has a 50-50 effect on a system of similar size, and it has no effect on a constellation with 30,000. But now let's go to a constellation with 30,000 satellites. It blocks the sky for the system with 300. It blocks the sky with 3,000, and we basically have détente with a system with 30,000. You know, this suggests to me that the rules that are written are encouraging size for the sake of size and not size for the sake of spectrum efficiency. And I think we need to reconsider the rules that were adopted a number of years ago because nobody contemplated these effects. The last thing I just want to touch on is physical orbits. Physical orbits in space are like lanes on a freeway. And you have altitudes at which you operate, which is obviously the up and down part, and inclinations, which is kind of the left and right part in the lane. And what we're seeing being proposed are constellations that basically consume wide swaths of the orbits, both in terms of the vertical dimension and the horizontal dimension. And it's not leaving space for other systems. You know, when in fact, with some prudent planning, we can actually interleave systems at various altitudes and within various inclinations and make more efficient use of the orbital resource. Now, the way the US is writing these rules, they basically hand out the orbits to a couple of operators and tell everyone else that they have to coordinate with them. We can have a discussion, if you like, about the incentives or lack of incentives people have to coordinate with their competitors. But the one thing I can say for sure is that the rest of the world is not going to sit by quietly while the US tries to divvy up spectrum and orbits in this manner. And the point I made earlier about competition and innovation suffering in the United States is important. If we don't find a way for these other systems to serve the United States, they will be deployed. They will serve the rest of the world. And we may find ourselves with the choices of only a couple constellations serving the United States, with the best of technology being used overseas. So I know I've gone on for a little bit. Just 3 points in conclusion. The risks are different with mega constellations. The rules we've used to date have to change. And above all, we need to ensure safety and competition in how we rewrite our rules.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Thanks for that overview. Very thought-provoking. And we're now going to dovetail over to Trey and hear his thoughts. And then I'll meet up at the tail end of that. Go for it, Trey.
All right, Joe. Thank you, John. As always, incredibly clear, very insightful. I wanted to maybe just take the devil's advocate perspective, be the sunshine to your rain. I am an optimist here in many respects. I share some of your concerns, but one thing is clear, that technology is outpacing the law in many respects. But what was fascinating in preparing for this discussion today was to take a look at the 2004 orbital debris order when the commission came out with that. Even then, the commission was talking about small sats as a phenomenon that was coming on strong, and mega constellations being contemplated for deployment. And what struck me was to find any reference to that at all, because that was really not anticipated, I think, by the commercial segment. But I think the FCC, even in its 2004 orbital debris mitigation order, did contemplate some of the mega constellations that we're seeing. And I also appreciate your point that the satellites that are being authorized in the non-geostationary sector are not confined to the US, and that we're in many ways in a global battle for this space, literally, to establish communication systems, and especially given the military application, especially important to the United States and other countries around the world, and China and others are not going to stand still, and they will authorize their own mega constellations, and that's going to balloon the numbers. But one thing I wondered about your numbers is the US is a key market. Many of these foreign systems are, receiving rights in the US, and so I wonder if there's maybe not a little bit of double counting, since they would have market access rights, and that might feed into the 50,000 NGSO tally that you came up with, which frankly is about right. That's consistent with my own kind of mental math that I've been thinking about. So maybe it's not as great as 250,000 small sats, or multiplying that over the lifetime of the years of their useful life, but it is a very large number, and it is a increase in the orbital, the risk of an in-orbit collision, and that risk could potentially prove catastrophic, and that's a concern that everyone should share and be deeply worried about, because in a worst case scenario, it could preclude access to space, and that's something that we really can't tolerate. So I think everyone is invested, or at least should be invested, in mitigating satellite collision risk and thinking holistically. And I took a little bit of heart from the SpaceX order, because the FCC seemed to be moving to the type of aggregate collision risk standard that you've talked about and advocated here, and away from the pointillistic single satellite risk. We're going to put blinders on to the rest of the constellation. And I thought that the comments that the commission has put forward about aggregate collision risk, there's an ongoing proceeding to change the orbital debris mitigation rules that were first adopted in 2004. So I think we're getting to a point where that's potentially going to happen pretty soon. But SpaceX's Mod 3, this third modification, the latest system redesign that they did, it does give some clues as to what the FCC might be looking toward. And I think they are pretty promising. I mean, the old standard used to assume if you were at all maneuverable, then there was zero risk. And what was interesting is the new order doesn't make that assumption anymore. They sort of concede that, you put something in space, the risk is no longer zero. It's up there. You could have a fault in orbit that could render the maneuverability compromised in some way, and that could create its own risk. Or you could simply encounter another object through no fault of your own that you cannot maneuver around. And so I think that that's something new and important to recognize, that anything introduced into the orbital environment will increase the risk of collision. And that seemed promising because there is this newfound reality. The other thing that I found a little bit heartening about the Mod 3 order and what it might say about where the Commission is headed with orbital debris mitigation was maintaining the 25-year disposal rule, that there's this general notion that the Commission in low Earth orbit expects everything to deorbit within 25 years. That's still a very long time because it might outlive the useful life of many of those LEOs, but it is a benchmark, and it's something to work from and to aspire to even better performance in the future. So I thought that that was important. And then they imposed a number of new reporting requirements. And they're not the kind of reporting requirements that were really just about disclosure. Do you have a plan at all? That was what the old rules were all about. These new rules are much more meaningful in my view because they require a semi-annual collision avoidance report. You have to have a semi-annual satellite reliability report. Do your satellites work? And that's been a problem for SpaceX, for example. And then what's your satellite disposal failure rate? So can they actually come out of orbit as you've expected? And those are much more specific, and they show, I think, more than 15 years of experience with orbital debris mitigation that provide a really sound basis to build from as a comprehensive regime to mitigate orbital debris. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think there's still really strong reasons for concern for all the reasons you state. And I'll add one more that you didn't mention, John, not to get too rainy day, but one thing that has been reported recently is climate change and the effect that that's having on carbon dioxide levels in the upper atmosphere. That as carbon dioxide increases, drag decreases, and that orbital life may be extended by 25% or more, depending on the altitude that you're in. And that could actually make it harder to meet even the 25-year rule in low Earth orbit, depending on a lot of macro climate change issues that we're only really beginning to understand. So we're operating in an environment that is going to be very congested, that has high risks associated with deploying in it, and that itself is changing in ways that our existing rules may not fully anticipate, not only because the technology is changing, but because the environment around us is changing as well. And so that, I think, is a cause for concern, but I do take hope that the FCC is really pushing forward in that space. Now I've got a number. I could talk for another 40 minutes about that, but maybe because we've got you here, I know Joe is very invested in these issues as well. Maybe you could share your views as to what you think about some of that and where the FCC is headed before we go on to the next topic. Oop, and I think you're on mute.
There we go. I got the unmute. New system.
Yeah.
I mean, Trey, a lot of very thoughtful points as always from you. I think the one thing that got my attention, and I probably am not quite aligned with you on, is this 25-year issue, and for two reasons. And let me try an analogy. Right, if we're all, again, sorry for the Washington analogy, but I imagine a lot of people on this are in Washington. If you're trying to get home in the afternoon and there's a wreck on the Beltway, it doesn't matter to you that the wreck's going to be removed overnight. What you care about is getting home. So the things that are cluttering the road when you're trying to operate are a problem for you then, right? I mean, The only thing that's certain in life are, taxes and death, and we don't like the two of those, so we try to avoid both of them. So let's take that to orbital debris. There is a common misnomer about LEO orbits, which is, it doesn't really matter because satellites will typically fall out of LEO orbit in most 5 to 6 years, even if nobody does anything. Well, okay, point number one, what about the 5 or 6 years when they're up there as unguided missiles and collisions can't be avoided, right? Hoping to get them down in 25 years doesn't do any good if there's a collision in the meantime. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that relying on the 25-year rule is enough. The other thing is that chart I showed earlier about what happens when debris spreads. When there's a collision, not if, but when there's a collision, that debris becomes, the satellites fragment, the debris spreads, and now this debris is in smaller pieces. And because the area to mass ratios are so much smaller, it takes longer to come out of orbit. And we can't count on that coming out of orbit in 25 years. So I think we need to be, more aggressive, and we need to be looking at making sure that these satellites are maneuverable and reliable, and they are promptly disposed of before they die. Mm-hmm. And that we need to be more aggressive. And only by doing that do we ensure that your sunny day arrives.
I think it's a starting point, and I hear you loud and clear that while it's up there, it's a hazard. And I think the reality is we will have to exercise leadership around the globe in order to get other countries to buy into that standard, because we are not, and we will not be, the only licensing administration, the only the bastion of satellite innovation. And hopefully we can lead by example and really impose some rigorous requirements that require, for example, maneuverability. I was, on the slightly, more involved side, there were a number of decisions that I think in the Mod 3 order where ViaSat was very active in talking about satellite debris surviving reentry, satellite launch and reentry, satellite collisions you mentioned here. The FCC largely neglected those or refused to examine them. They said that they had considered them and that ViaSat presented insufficient information in some cases to demonstrate the risk. What do you think is the increment of risk that you need to demonstrate in order to satisfy this FCC in particular? You had called into question, for example, SpaceX's orbital safety record, but did not, according to the FCC, provide enough detail. What's that increment of detail need to be in your mind in order to satisfy the FCC after having engaged them just really recently?
I don't know anymore. In the old days, when it comes to analyzing whether or not your spacecraft are going to survive reentry and present a hazard, one normally would have done an analysis using standard NASA software. You'd run your constellation through the software. It would produce a result, and that analysis could be validated. It's conceptually no different than the types of interference analyses you and I have seen over the years, right? Here are the inputs, here's the software, we do the work, we can argue over the inputs, but at least we have the problem basically bounded. In this case, there is nothing on the record that indicates that type of NASA DAS analysis was done in this case. The analysis was done on a prior version of the spacecraft. The FCC said, I'd like to see a more complete analysis. The applicant said, never mind, I've abandoned that one, but here's a newfangled version, and trust me, it's going to be okay. So my question for you, Trey, since I'm not in private practice anymore, when you have a client who asks you to file an application, are you simply going to say, I think it's going to be okay? Kreskin says everything's good, and is that going to survive scrutiny at the FCC? What do you think?
I think the more robust the showing, the more likely the grant will be, and I think it's an opportunity for the FCC to provide greater clarity when they do issue this orbital debris order. And hopefully this is an opportunity for the FCC to step forward and provide the industry with a roadmap of what they actually need to demonstrate. That's what I would hope for. We'll see whether that actually materializes. One thing, and I know we've got about 10 minutes or so before we, or maybe less, before we want to open it up for questions. Joe, maybe we want to open it up now.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes and we'll open it up. But this is, I've been quiet because I'm wrapped, attentive. If you want to finish your answer, and then I have a few things I'd love to add to both your considerations.
Okay. Well, I did want to just touch on briefly, since it is the NSMA, on the spectrum component. There is a rule in place, 6% delta T over T. It's an improvement, I think, in many ways of the old orbital avoidance angle where you sort of cordoned off a 10-degree window and couldn't transmit at all. And the basic rule is you exceed a certain threshold and then you split the spectrum. And I think it's an element of mutually assured destruction for the NGSOs. If you really don't want to share, you'll come up with a better solution. I think it's premised on causing enough pain to develop private negotiated solutions. And that was true back in the MSS licensing era, where everybody split the spectrum in the 2 gigahertz band, and it got easier as people dropped out or reached agreements among themselves. And I see that as a potentially positive way forward. The one area, much like the 25-year rule or some of the other issues, is what do you do with licensees who are granted authority in different rounds of spectrum? And what does it really mean to be first in time? Is it important that you've launched your satellite first? Is it important that you were granted in the first round, but subsequently redesigned your system to be unrecognizable from what you originally filed? Or is it, as SpaceX wants, to have the most efficient system, whatever that is? And I don't know how you measure efficiency. Is it satellites per person? Is it hertz under use? Is it, number of connections completed? There are lots of different efficiency metrics that one could trot out. But to me, the privately negotiated solution is desirable, and creating incentives that encourage good faith and fair dealing is essential. And trying to weight that playing field to achieve various social goals, first in time, first in right, more efficient system, what have you, gets very complicated, because how do you weight that properly? Who decides what public policies we're going to vindicate? And then how do you know you're not doing too much or too little one way or the other? So I think that's a challenge for the FCC, but it's an opportunity for the industry, for spectrum managers to really think creatively about what could be done in this area and how better solutions could be arrived at, because it is a very complex environment.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. There's a lot packaged in there, and there's a few thoughts that might foot the bill, so to speak, that for everyone to talk about. One is maneuverability as designed versus maneuverability as designed but validated by a trial versus maneuverability as delivered in the trial before any mega launch and then insured. So are there insurance companies and underwriters willing to bet that the trial as delivered is good enough for a mega launch? Same thing with spectrum management. Same thing with the design on other key material aspects of the operation as promised. So kind of to repeat that, a proven insurability and underwriting around design. That design is validated by a small trial before any mega launch, and everything's conditioned on insurability. And that insurability, going back to the global leadership, if we set the global standard, insurance companies often do not stop at borders. We push to make that at the ITU and every other area where we have influence and where reason potentially could surmount ready, fire, aim versus ready, aim, fire. Then we use that as a global leadership term. So that's one thing, and I'll be quiet in a moment. There's a couple other trend lines, just a preview on the latest Starlink ruling and how that opened up a NEPA case. And I think that would be something to talk about in a little bit as well. But I'll maybe if you guys want to answer the first question, then I'll jump to the NEPA real quick.
Trey, you want to go first, or you want me to?
Well, I don't know that I have a lot of thoughts on insurability other than to say, that seems like a really innovative way to approach it. There's elements of that in the current rules and standards to some degree, but I like the idea in many ways of having a trial, having a test, and I like the ability to validate. I think the countervailing consideration would be, does this slow deployment? Does this create an uncertain environment for investment? And I think that's the pushback that you would get, because in the back of the US administration's mind, I think, is we really do want to be home for satellite investment and innovation. We have to be a hospitable environment for that to occur. We have done a good job in the past of pushing satellites out of the United States by adopting overly cumbersome rules. So we want to balance the need for attracting capital and encouraging experimentation and development of space resources, while at the same time allowing for these validation systems. We don't want to swamp this nascent industry with excessively burdensome requirements. So it's a bit of a tightrope in my view of how you walk it. John?
A lot there. Let me try quickly. I generally would have thought that the point about insurance would be a good one, but recently was informed that a very, very small percentage of satellites in LEO are insured. Don't quote me on the number, but I heard recently from an insurance rep that it's in the low single digits are actually insured. So I don't think we can count on insurance as being a check in the marketplace, because many people are choosing to launch without insurance in terms of operations.
Although, John, I think he's trying to say, Joe is trying to say, maybe it should be a requirement in order to raise the bar on reliability in space.
Well, if you did, it certainly would function as a check, right? So if that's what you meant, Joe, sorry if I misunderstood you. There's a whole lot of issues with that about, whether you force people to buy insurance when they're capable of self-insuring. That's a longer discussion. But yes, sorry if I misunderstood again, but if that's what you meant, sure, that could be a third-party source of standards, if you will. I think that what we're talking about in terms of testing is what I would call a trust but verify approach, which in many respects makes a lot of sense, particularly when you realize that if you make a mistake in space, you can't clean it up like you can on Earth.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if somebody deploys something in a cellular network that doesn't work, right, not the end of the world. You pull the cell site down, you redeploy it, there's kind of no harm. You put something up in space, it doesn't work, it causes a collision, it can have long-term consequences. And I think I'll respectfully disagree on how things play out in the marketplace. I think the way the rules are getting written, the rules in the United States are favoring a very small handful of companies. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I think we need to worry about competition and innovation in the US, because to paraphrase Ross Perot, that giant sucking sound you hear is the industry going overseas and serving the rest of the world, because the environment is more hospitable to competition than it currently is in the United States. Nice.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate both of your thoughts on that, and two quick wrappers. And I think there's a sizable demand, and one of the questions we had, I'll lob out. Two of the questions we had, I'll lob out there. But I also think if you guys are willing, maybe we do one of our dedicated webinars on this subject and go deep on some of these, because there's a lot here, and there's a lot of pinging on it. Another thought, it was a spectrum-related thought, is and I know it's come up from time to time about auctioning certain amounts of spectrum and maybe tying it to performance standards in the design and validation. I don't know if you're really ready to talk about that, especially with given our time frame, but wanted to throw it out there. And the other was going along the lines of the recent case. I don't know if you guys can see the slides here, but and I'm going to go past a lot of these, but there's a general basket of issues related to beyond debris into the what we call the NEPA realm. And with the new administration, NEPA seems to be something that is upfront and will be upfront, whether it's the recent SpaceX order or some other related satellite mega constellations. What is the impact on our sight lines, on everything from a variety of other aspects? I know over at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, they're talking about a lot of the camouflage satellites now absorb heat, which burn their electronics, which might impugn their maneuverability and everything like that. Is all this stuff tested? There's some other elements this month. Just a week or two ago, National Geographic came out with this large study that sharks navigate the entire Earth's magnetic field. That's how they get around. That's how whales and turtles and birds and butterflies know to get precisely, and salmon back to a very precise geo point. Are we messing with that in any way? Is that even being studied, and should it be studied? And are we going to lose our global leadership while we're studying it and China isn't? And all these things, are really in the salad for everyone to really think about. But we are. If you guys have a minute or two, if you want to address any of those for a minute or two, and then we'll have to carry on to the next next event. But I would love to get maybe a minute from each of you if you got that. So. And also, just so the panelists know, we do have one raised hand currently from James Wolfson. So. Oh, all right. Well, let's get James on live. I asked a couple of questions that got out there that came also, but so everyone can have James's as well. That's a good idea. So we can get a live audience member. Go ahead, James. James runs XDOT, by the way, which is a big coordination outfit.
Okay, I guess I'm on. You can hear me? We can hear you, James. Okay, real quick. When a launch of a vehicle goes to space, I'll pick on SpaceX or something. They send something to the space station or to the moon or something like that. How do they thread through all these LEOs, MEOs, whatever the hell they are flying around up there? And somehow that seems kind of risky, the way it's shown in the diagrams you have. And the other one is, I think there's got to be some guy like the one that invented Pac-Man to put a satellite in orbit that goes around and just gobbles up the satellites like Pac-Man did. That's mine.
So I'll take that, and maybe I can hop back to Joe's question real briefly, and John, please weigh in as well. But space is incredibly vast, and yes, there is a great wealth of satellites in orbit, and there are many more on the way, but these are ping pong balls in the ocean. And I think it is in fact true that if there is an intersection event and there's an explosion of some sort, it clutters the environment. It is not a productive or helpful thing. It is really imperative to undertake that, but it is a very vast space even in low Earth orbit, and certainly as you get further out, it becomes even less cluttered. It's something that you have to be aware of, but right now it's still such a vast territory that, by and large, these orbital debris objects, at least above a certain size, can each be individually tracked, and generally are. I think the risk is very small. Orbital debris can still be quite dangerous, and so that's a concern. But we are talking about an entirely different order of magnitude when we talk about the available space, but it's not limited, and so we do need to take precautions. But that's my perspective. John, I don't know if you'd like to offer a bit more.
Yeah, and look, I mean, there's no surprise that Joe and picked Trey and me because we wouldn't agree on everything. So I can respectfully disagree with my longtime colleague Trey once again. Yeah, space is big, but with the exponential growth we're seeing in orbital debris and with the massive numbers of new satellites, I don't think that LEO real estate, which is what we're concerned about, the orbits closest to Earth, are big enough to support the safe operation of an unlimited number of LEO satellites in these mega constellations. And we need to study and understand what those limits are, and then develop a suitable regime. And we need to do that before we fill it up, is my perspective.
Gentlemen, we're pleased as punch to have you. We can't encourage you enough to talk more about this, and we invite you back, and hopefully we can do more of it. I know there's a lot of hand claps going up. I don't know if you can see them on the screen. People are enjoying this. So this is definitely getting to the heart of the issues that everyone is really curious about, and you two are really at the apex of understanding how to articulate this as we navigate forward. And we do want the country to be on the helm of whatever happens in the satellite world for sure. And we just want to do it well. All right. And excellence is always our goal. And I know you guys are on that helm as well. So thank you. We look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon. And we'll be on the next panel very shortly. See you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.